Hey friends, how we doing today? We are looking at the origins of the civil rights movement. When we think civil rights movement, we usually think two things. We think South, and we think Martin Luther King Jr. Perhaps we also think 1950s. Historians have, and that's kind of still in the popular imagination. Historians have largely given up on that dating of the civil rights movement. Instead, we look to the North. We look to World War II, and we look to cities as the origins of the civil rights movement. And so, kind of what you'll be getting from me from audio lectures from the rest of this course are kind of what we call the long civil rights movement, and helping you to understand the context in which the more classic dating of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Birmingham, you were going to be covering all that stuff, but really the civil rights movement is beginning before then. So we want to look at the northern origins of the civil rights movement briefly here, and then in the second part of our video, we'll get into the 1950s a little bit. Understand what makes the civil rights movement possible is the movement of African Americans out of the South. And of course, there had always been African Americans in the North and northern cities. This was, there were a number of free blacks in the North before the Civil War. That was certainly the case after, but the mass migration of African Americans out of the South and into places like New York City during World War I, Detroit during World War II, really begins in the context of war. World War I sees the first great migration between 1914 and 1918. It's estimated that 300,000 African Americans left the South, moved into northern cities because there were economic opportunities provided by the war. The Great Migration kind of stopped or slowed down after World War I, but with larger populations of free blacks in the North, that meant that families had an easier time migrating out of the South and into the North for jobs too. So it's still continuing during the 20s and 30s, but it really accelerates during World War II as more jobs open up, particularly in Detroit, the arsenal of democracy, where there's massive numbers of jobs created by our need for building weapons of little and mass destruction. So African Americans are leaving the South in even greater numbers than they left during World War I. So understand the economic, obviously the push out of the South, the limited economic and educational opportunities, continuing violence, and Jim Crow suppression of blacks in the South is the push factor. But you kind of need the pull factor too, and the pull factor is these opportunities for new jobs, the pool of family that are in the first half of the 20th century, bringing hundreds of thousands of African Americans out of the South into the North, especially to cities, into America's industrial sector, and laying the foundation for the civil rights movement. African Americans are, to the extent that Jim Crow is trying to make African Americans kind of invisible or marginal, the Great Migration, and the need particularly for jobs during wartime are turning African Americans into a national presence. We do have to understand too, I think this is a point I made before, Jim Crow, segregation, racial suppression is not something that was limited to the South. When you have African Americans moving into the North, you have Northerners begin to act just like their white Southern counterparts did too. And that is in many ways what begins in the context of World War II, the civil rights movement as you and I know it. So kind of the dating of the civil rights movement is not the Rosa Parks bus boycott in Montgomery, right? That's what begins kind of the King era of the civil rights movement. But really, that's in many ways the second or the third, you might say, phase of the civil rights movement. I probably would say the civil rights movement 2.0 when King emerges. Really, the civil rights movement begins in World War II begins in the North, begins in cities, begins in labor unions, and begins with the so-called double V movement. So if you can, kind of put a pin in Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., turn your attention 10 years earlier to the double V movement. Double V standing for double victory. With the coming of World War II, African Americans affirm we are American, we will help to defend democracy abroad, but we are going to fight for democracy at home. This is a connection. African Americans have begun making this connection during the 1930s, including Paul Robeson and others. That fascism, they're looking at fascism abroad, the suppression, persecution of Jews in places like Germany, and they're saying we already have fascism here in the United States. Jim Crow. What is Jim Crow? Jim Crow is fascism. Interestingly, historians have uncovered that the Nazis, in looking to figure out how they could segregate, suppress Jews during the 1930s, actually studied America's Jim Crow system. Nazism in Germany was in part inspired by and shaped by the segregation system within the United States. So this connection that African Americans in the 1930s are drawing between the persecution of Jews and the persecution of African Americans in the United States is a definite one. And so as the United States goes to war against fascism after 1939, African Americans are saying, yes, we will help you defeat fascism abroad, but we are going to commit ourselves to defeating fascism at home. It's a double victory. This is how one 15-year-old put it, and I'm sorry I have to paraphrase. I lost my notes when I moved my office. This is, from my recollection, this is what this 15-year-old said. As we look to defend democracy from foreign attack, let us give fair play and free opportunity to all persons. You might have heard of this 15-year-old before, Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah. Understand Martin Luther King Jr., while he's still a young man, is being shaped by the double V of African American, of his African American elders. The double victory campaign, it's rooted in the North, it's rooted in cities, and it's a lot of it is rooted in labor unions. It took a lot of different forms. One form was the fight against discrimination in America's defense industry. As I said, African Americans are moving into the North and the South. They're looking to get in these defense jobs. They want to become part of the arsenal of democracy. When they get there, they're finding that employers don't want to hire them, or workers don't want to, are trying to drive them out of the workplace. One person who would not stand for this, the labor organizer A. Philip Randolph. Understand, look, there were African Americans fighting for civil rights even before the double V, fighting for increased economic and educational opportunities in the North for free blacks, before the double V. But the war context kind of provides this opportunity for African Americans to make a much more concerted effort for civil rights, increased rights, or just basic rights for African Americans. And one of those leaders is A. Philip Randolph, a longtime veteran labor organizer for African Americans in the North. Randolph sees what's going on in the defense industries. Here, African Americans are moving in, wanting to take these jobs. They're being kept out. Randolph sees what's going in the U.S. military. Yes, the U.S. military is going to fight fascism, but they're going to do so with a predominantly segregated military. Segregation, Jim Crow, continue to characterize America's military forces during World War II until the end, when there was a little bit of integration. But for the most part, we fought World War II with the segregated military. Randolph just realized this contradiction. How can the United States be fighting for democracy abroad when it doesn't practice democracy at home? This was a huge contradiction. This was a huge hypocrisy for the United States. And Randolph also saw this as an opportunity, right? Countries have to win not just military conflicts. They also have to win image conflicts. They have to win the propaganda conflicts. It is really hard for the United States to enter into a conflict like World War II, fighting for democracy, talking about being the arsenal of democracy when they maintain a segregated military force. And so Randolph and other civil rights leaders launched the Double V campaign. One form that this took for Randolph called up the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, said, look, President Roosevelt, um, African Americans want to help defeat fascism abroad. We want to serve in the armed forces. We want to be full soldiers. We want to participate in the arsenal of democracy. But you're not allowing us to do so. So here's what we're going to do. This is 1941. 1 million of my friends and I are going to march on Washington, D.C. to protest the continuing segregation of America's military establishment. Roosevelt freaks out because, again, America has to win not just the actual war, but it has to win the propaganda war too, right? It has to convince foreign peoples that America really is on the side of democracy. And how can they do that when America is practicing exactly the same kind of segregation and oppression of minorities that the Nazis are in Germany? And so a 1 million-man protest on Washington, D.C. By African Americans was going to look really, it was going to be a real PR problem, frankly, for the United States. And so Roosevelt's like, well, I can't really do anything about the armed forces at this point, but African Americans wanting to work in defense industries, there's something I can do about that. And so Roosevelt, in mid-1941, signs into law the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC. The armed forces are not desegregated. Nevertheless, Randolph calls off the 1 million-man march. It doesn't happen. And it's because Randolph says, well, we'll work on the military. We at least got the FEPC. The FEPC, the first of its kind, the first time that the U.S. government is policing racial discrimination, right? The government had supported worker rights in the past, but not along racial lines. So the first of its kind, the Fair Employment Practices Commission to police racial discrimination in America's defense industries. The way that the FEPC generally worked was African Americans who were discriminated against wouldn't be hired or mistreated in a particular defense industry would go on strike. They would raise attention to what was going on there, and then that forced the federal government to come in to investigate and to see if, in fact, that particular industry, that particular employer was practicing fair employment. And if they weren't, obviously, they were fined or shut down. Here's what I want to stress about the Fair Employment Practices Commission. This was established not because Roosevelt and the country and white America decided to get right on the civil rights question because they recognized the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home. That's not why it came about. Roosevelt was forced to do this by the unprecedented activism of African Americans. And the Fair Employment Practices Commission worked because African Americans made it work through their strike activities. In other words, this is not white America getting right on civil rights. This is African Americans using the context of war and America's international reputation to force white America to get right on civil rights, at least in this narrow area of employment and defense industries. So understand the double V is not this kind of top-down government giving civil rights to African Americans. The double V is this grassroots campaigns of veteran African American civil rights leaders using the opportunity of war to organize African Americans in ways that they just had not done before. The prospect, the threat of a 1 million-person march of African Americans on Washington, D.C. Was just something that had not been possible in American history until the Great Migration spread out the African American population throughout the United States, but particularly bringing it to the north and northern cities, made something like this kind of activity possible. And the double V, in the context of the war, just led African Americans to a place of unprecedented activism. African Americans had been fighting for within the context of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. All right, separate but equal. Okay, so let's make American schools. Let's make like black schools and public accommodations, and let's just increase rights for African Americans, but within a segregated system. It's during the Double V that African Americans, you can see from the picture there, African Americans said we are separate but equal does not work. We need to end Jim Crow. Jim Crow needs to die as a result of this war. And so the Double V just saw unprecedented activism among African Americans mobilizing for their civil rights. But it's happening mainly in the North, and it's happening in cities, and it's happening especially early on in labor unions. So the FEPC does not, we don't segregate our military during World War II. Fair Employment Practices Commission does not last. After World War II is ended, it ends as well too. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, in 1948 tried to create a permanent fair employment practices as a part of his civil rights package. Ultimately, it won't happen. The Democratic Party in 1948 is still largely based in the South. The South is still segregationist, so the Democratic Party is still kind of upholding racial segregation there. It really limits what a Harry Truman or later presidents like Kennedy, Johnson could do in terms of civil rights. But in 1948, the armed forces are desegregated. We didn't fight World War II. We didn't fight fascism with an integrated military. We will fight the Cold War with an integrated military. But again, this was a consequence of the Double V, or the continuing Double V. Randolph and his friends after World War II formed the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. And they threatened, again in the context of America's international reputation, how can you call yourself the leaders of the free world fighting to defeat communism and totalitarianism around the world while you maintain a segregated military? It just is hypocritical. And so as a part to protect, to kind of make consistent America's international reputation, Truman desegregated the military, tried to push a civil rights package through in 1948. But again, it's grassroots pressure by African Americans like A. Philip Randolph that are forcing the federal government to get right on these questions of civil rights. And I want you to notice before we move on, League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah, nonviolent direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience are things we associate with Martin Luther King Jr. And Rosa Parks in the 50s and 60s. Understand nonviolent civil disobedience, which they learned from Gandhi and in India during World War II. These things are being practiced by African Americans well before King enters onto the scene. King is learning from people like Randolph and the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. They are his teachers. The Double V is the teachers of your Rosa Parks and your Martin Luther King Jr. So understand, again, the civil rights movement does not begin in the 50s with King and Parks. It's beginning with people like A. Philip Randolph back in the 40s, and it's beginning in the North. It's beginning in cities. The Double V just the war context just creates all kinds of new support and radical support for Black civil rights. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had been around since 1908, but it had largely been fighting in a let's make equal within a separate context. Let's make accommodations, opportunities more equal. The NAACP during World War II increases its membership ninefold. By the end of World War II, the NAACP now has a membership of 450,000 people. This gives it a numerical but also a financial power it had not had before, and the NAACP itself becomes part of the Double V, setting its sights not on making Jim Crow work more efficiently, but on laying Jim Crow to rest. Ultimately, the Brown versus Board of Education decision is an NAACP case, or one that they pushed forward made possible because the NAACP, as a consequence of World War II, has all these numbers, has this new financial power, has this new visibility. We'll talk about Brown in the next lecture, but do understand that what makes Brown possible are the conditions of African Americans mobilizing in much greater numbers during World War II. And because of World War II, the NAACP is one beneficiary of that. Congress on Racial Equality, which would lead the freedom rides, the attempts to desegregate America's bus system in 1960. CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, which would play a significant role in the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 1960s. CORE begins in 1944, practicing nonviolent civil disobedience. So all these things we associate with the 50s and 60s are actually being pioneered in the 1940s, but in a very different, kind of social context than what we usually think of the civil rights movement. Just another example of African Americans just being unwilling to accept Jim Crow anymore is the Sojourner Truth Public Housing Project, a story right here in Detroit. So Sojourner Truth was intended to be low-cost public housing for defense workers. As Southerners, and it's large numbers of African Americans, but poor whites are moving into cities like Detroit as well too. The government's saying it's not enough for just to build factories and stuff for us to make our weapons of little and mass destruction. We need to provide housing for all these Southerners coming in as well too. And so Sojourner Truth, named for the civil rights, the anti-slavery activist of the 19th century, the Sojourner Truth Public Housing Project is going to be a housing project for African Americans, centered in Detroit. But as you can see from that sign in the corner there, Detroiters were not too happy about African Americans moving into Detroit, and they especially weren't too happy about them moving into the Sojourner Truth neighborhood, surrounded by a white community. Again, my point: when African Americans actually become or seek to move north, you find white Northerners acting just like their white Southerners did, trying to enforce Jim Crow segregation and limit the economic and educational opportunities of these African American migrants into the North. So this sparks a conflict. To their discredit, the government, under pressure from white Detroit, says, okay, so public housing. All right, so Sojourner Truth, it's not going to be. This is 1942. This is going on. Early 1942. This is going on. Sojourner Truth is going to not be for African Americans. It's going to be for white families. And then they receive protests from African Americans. And they say, okay, so Sojourner Truth is going to be public housing for African Americans. So the people who built this, the government, is kind of going back and forth, and that's just increasing tensions. So in February of 1942, the very year in which the FEPC is going into effect, 14 families look to move into the Sojourner Truth. They're going to hold about can hold close to a couple of hundred families. About 14 families are looking to move into Sojourner Truth. When they do, they would be confronted by 600 white families from surrounding communities who are going to refuse to let these 14 families move in. These 14 families will be accompanied by 300 African Americans from Detroit looking to help them move in, safely move in. So you can imagine what happened, race riot. And this was pretty common. In fact, there were a number of race riots. Detroit's largest race riot would actually occur during 1943, but several northern cities had race riots because this kind of thing is going on throughout northern cities during World War II. African Americans are pressing their economic, their educational rights, and white America is pushing back against them, and it's sparking all kinds of racial violence. during throughout World War II. And so what happens in Sojourner Truth in February is this a kind of an early manifestation of a violence that would be much more rampant in 1943 and 1944. Ultimately, these 14 families are not allowed to move in. The police would come, about 200 people would be arrested. Almost all of them would be African Americans. So you can understand just the amount of white resistance, white racial violence against these African Americans, and a police force which obviously is siding with the white community, trying to preserve white supremacy in Detroit. But these are different years. African Americans are not going to back down. This is how one person who was involved in this conflict put it, and I have to paraphrase again because I don't have the exact quote. The army wants to send me to fight for democracy abroad, but I just as soon fight for democracy right here. The Double V is inspiring African Americans, not just at the A. Philip Randolph level, but all the way down at the very grassroots level of Detroit in the fight over the Sojourner Truth Public Housing Project. Now, to their credit, the government sides with African Americans. And so about a month after this conflict, they would send out over 1,000 state and local police officers to ensure that these 14 families could safely move into Sojourner Truth. Eventually, about 168 families would live in this public housing project. But the Sojourner Truth public housing project it shows how much the times have changed and how particularly the war context and the Great Migration has changed America. These are not things that could have happened, I think, in any other context. It's not simply that African Americans are emboldened to end Jim Crow, to engage in unprecedented grassroots activism, to try new strategies like nonviolent civil disobedience, to really force the United States to confront its terrible civil rights record. But it's also the fact that the government is coming in on the side of the civil rights protesters in ways that they had not done before, and probably would not have done were it not for concern for America's international reputation. Was Roosevelt or was even Truman, were these guys great civil rights believers? No, absolutely they were not. But they were forced to become so because of concern for America's international reputation. And we'll see that, kind of the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the desegregation of the armed forces, the Sojourner Truth victory is going to continue to spark racial violence during World War II. It's going to spark racial violence in the 50s and 60s as African Americans continue to develop the civil rights movement as it moves south to cities like Montgomery with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and cities like Birmingham. Understand, though, this is beginning in the North. It's beginning during World War II, and it's beginning under the logic of the Double V. African Americans are going to help the United States defeat fascism abroad, but they're also going to organize to defeat fascism at home, and they will have the support of the government again and again and again. I don't want to make too much of it because the government, particularly in the 1950s, will be pretty slow to act in some areas. But building on Sojourner Truth and the Public Housing Project, for instance, and a major Supreme Court decision in 1947, Shelley versus Kramer. Before this time, communities in the United States could organize and form covenants. These covenants could say this is a white-only community. They could, kind of just through their organizing, they could uphold white supremacy in their neighborhoods. Shelley versus Kramer, the Supreme Court says those restrictive covenants, racially restrictive covenants, are unconstitutional. You're denying, basic civil rights to African Americans and trying to keep them out of adequate, decent housing. and trying to drive them out of the housing market. So again, another decision made in the context of now in 1947 moving from World War II and moving into the Cold War. How can the United States propose to be fighting totalitarianism abroad when they maintain a totalitarian system against African Americans at home? So Shelley versus Kramer was significant in mobilizing not just African Americans but many white liberals in the 1950s to push for open housing, as it was called. And I mentioned this for one reason. We're not going to dig too deeply into it. But it did look, with decisions like desegregating the U.S. military, the Shelley versus Kramer in 1947, it did look like there was a significant opportunity to end segregation in the United States as the government is coming in on the side of the double V'ers. Open housing, several northern cities, but even some southern cities. Atlanta, for instance, had a pretty significant open housing movement, but probably the greatest open housing movement was actually in Detroit, as you had African Americans, particularly African American churches, but you had white liberals in the city as well too, working towards a Detroit which would be racially integrated. Now, of course, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen because of white flight. You'll be learning about that. We'll be talking about that in future lectures. But do understand that it looked like at the beginning of the Cold War, and because of the Cold War, that the United States was going to move very rapidly towards racial integration. So understand how World War I, launched the Great Migration. World War II sped it up. And the context of fighting fascism, fighting communism, created opportunities for African Americans to mobilize in ways that they could not have done in any other way. But they're mobilizing in places where they can. Mobilizing in the South, giving Jim Crow and racial violence there was just a lot tougher. So that would come later. In the North, Jim Crow is not quite so legally established there, and frankly, not quite as supported. There's more white liberals in the North than there are in the South, for instance. And so the Double V campaign, the campaign to end Jim Crow, to kill fascism abroad, but to kill fascism in the United States in the form of Jim Crow, probably only could have happened in the context of World War II and happened in the North. Now, I'm not going to lecture on Paul Robeson. You have seen the documentary. I just want to say this, that the Cold War kind of cut both ways in terms of the African American community within the United States. For those African Americans who chose to fight against the Cold War, to in some ways upset the double V logic as Robeson did, right? Robeson will not vote. As you know from the documentary, Robeson will not vote to continue the double V, right? He will not say, yes, African Americans are going to help win the fight against the Soviet Union. No, instead he says something to the effect of, no, why would African Americans fight a war against the Soviet Union to defend a way of life which continues to oppress African Americans? And we saw how the Cold War destroyed Paul Robeson, right? It wasn't simply just that his conception of civil rights, right? Robeson's conception of civil rights, the same as Du Bois, the same as the Pan-African Congress, which you might be reading about. They had a much more international conception of civil rights. If African Americans want to enjoy greater rights in the United States, then we have to end colonialism in Africa. It's only as Africa becomes free that Black persons throughout the world, the African descended persons throughout the world, will gain their freedom as Africa itself is freed. That politics is destroyed by the Cold War as the United States and other countries look to, in many ways, revitalize the colonialization of Africa in the 1950s. But it's not just Paul Robeson's politics or his conception of civil rights which is destroyed. It's the man himself, right? It's his career which is destroyed by the Cold War. So much so that even with the revival of Robeson in the late 50s and 60s, even with the way that he is celebrated in New Jersey and some other places today, most Americans have not heard of Paul Robeson. Again, I will say, arguably the most talented American that ever lived, and we just don't know who this person is. So the civil rights movement destroyed, and the same could be said as W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was forced to resign from the NAACP. Like Du Bois, like founded the NAACP. He's driven out of his own organization because of the Cold War, and we'll look at other ways in which the Cold War hurt African Americans. Right, even King himself was. The FBI, the CIA had spies in the civil rights movement. It's possible that the federal government actually was involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. We just don't know, but we know that the federal government was in all kinds of ways trying to discredit this guy as a communist. And seeing any kind of civil rights activities in the late 50s and 60s as motivated by communism. And so the Cold War hurt the civil rights cause in many ways. But as you'll see in part 2 of the lecture, for those African Americans like the NAACP, like Walter White, those who chose to continue the Double V into the Cold War, those who chose to suggest African Americans will help defeat communism abroad as we continue to fight for civil rights at home. We'll see that the Cold War did provide some gains for African Americans too. And we'll see how the Brown versus Board of Education decision was in some ways a Cold War decision as well too. That's in part 2. Thanks for hanging through part 1. See you guys on the flip side.